Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. Well, look, welcome everyone to the webcast. Very pleased to have the speakers that we have here today. Let me introduce myself, John Schloman. I'm with Microsoft, Senior Account Executive. We also have with us today Sondra Feinberg from Microsoft, who's a Program Manager for our Fraud Protection Solution. And then we have Ajith Alexander, one of our partners of WhoIAM. He is a founder and head of product management. And hopefully today will open your eyes to what's possible with the fraud protection solution of Microsoft and how you can hopefully learn some good information that'll help you keep your organization secure. Uh, we have a jam-packed agenda. First, what we want to do is kind of start out with some of the key issues and challenges that we're hearing across the country related to fraud abuse. And once we sort of outline those, then we're going to kind of dive into what our solution looks like from an overview perspective, kind of give you a lay of the land. And then that's when we'll hand off to our partner who's going to go through and talk a little bit about what the solution architecture looks like for an optimal fraud protection solution leveraging Microsoft technology, which will include a demonstration as well as talk a little bit about some best practices and lessons learned from the field that we want to share with you. Um, as Catherine may or may not have mentioned, any questions you have, put those in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. We'll look to address all of those questions at this Q&A period. We've saved time to do that at the very end. And then we'll next steps for you that you may want to take advantage of. So with that, that's our agenda. I'm going to turn it over to Sondra, who's going to take us through the issues and challenges. Sondra?
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it. So, when we talk about issues and challenges, it's important to understand the landscape of where we're at today. John, if you can just go to the next slide. Ever since COVID, government offices have just been inundated with money, with federal funds, and we all think that that's a good thing. Most of the time it is, but with staffing shortages and legacy technology systems, it's really impeding the management and oversight of those benefits. With the heightened risk of fraud, record high claims and eligibility procedures have increased because of the fraud. We had some people in our headquarters in Washington State that were getting calls saying your unemployment claim has been approved. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm still working. So a lot of fraudsters are out there. And what's happening is that our leaders need to ensure that their constituents feel safe and that these funds are actually going to the people who need them the most. Next slide, please, John. So we wanted just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some departments that are facing some of these challenges. We know that there's about 35 to 40% of new applications for benefits, unemployment benefits are fraudulent. Can you believe that? That's a huge number. There's over $36 billion that have been lost to fraud nationally in unemployment fraud since 2020. And 70% of the caseload relates to unemployment fraud. So it's not just about helping people, but it's about helping the right people. Next slide, John. So when we look at some of the challenges, it's really comes down to one core issue because state agencies have moved away from call centers due to online enrollment and qualification to meet the volume of requests for services, and that results in less in-person validation. Now, you say, well, I send my ID validation to an outside provider. That is great, but I bet that outside provider is charging an arm and a leg. So those operational expenses can really impact the state agencies as well. Next slide. So when we talk about money and we talk about unemployment insurance, there's also things with rental assistance. You know, the rental assistance program made available 25 billion to assist households unable to pay rent and utilities. And we're now just finding out that the Justice Department charged 500 individuals for defrauding the government of $569 million. How is that possible? It's just mind blowing how some of these things are happening out there. And basically, the rental assistance checks, they are not flowing to the individuals that should qualify for funds. And they're flowing to people who should not qualify for funds. So, how do you do a better job? What's the best way to meet with the demand, have somewhat of a comforting feel to what you're trying to do for your constituents, but do it in a cost-effective manner? Next slide. The things that we talk about cost effectiveness, when you have a legacy system, that's where some of these challenges come in because it's inadequate to process the data. We talk about the amount of people and applications. It's really the amount of data that is flowing through the legacy systems. They are not designed to capture this. They are not designed in an adaptive AI world, which is where we want to talk to you and bring you up to date with these technologies. Next slide, John. So with that, one more slide. We wanted to talk a little bit about the Microsoft Fraud Protection for Government solution. We call it DFP, although it's called Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection. We do want to let you know that you do not need to use any other Dynamics products in order to run this solution. Now, I talked a little bit about adaptive AI, and this means that we can basically help and protect digital constituent identities and public benefits because we're able to reduce fraud and abuse, reduce operational expenses, and increase constituent satisfaction. The three core capabilities on this solution are what we call constituent identity. This is to help protect identities and safeguard user accounts from abuse and fraud by combating account takeover and fraudulent account access. The second one is online payments. Wouldn't it be great for you to have a tool for when people want to pay their child support? Many of you have websites where people can go in and pay their bills. But can you automatically see if they're using a stolen credit card to do that? That's very important. It's not just pay out, but also what's coming into your environment. And then benefit protection. This is really about preventing fraudulent account creation and bot-generated synthetic identities from claiming access to benefits. And I'll give you a case study in just a moment of something that happened to one of our states. And it was quite dramatic as far as the amount of money that was going out and how the fraudsters were identified. Next slide, please. This is that particular case study I was referring to. So this is real life. This was when unemployment was going through the roof. This particular state was accepting 130,000 new accounts per week. Now, mind you, how many people do you have in your processing center? Okay, so 130,000 new accounts per week. They were losing $500 million in fake unemployment claims. They were experiencing 700,000 account logins per week. Their systems, it was very, very difficult to keep up without crashing the systems. So what was going on was that the constituents, or what they thought were constituents, were creating fake accounts and compromising their good constituent accounts for unemployment benefit request. And they were using a third-party device fingerprinting company. And this device fingerprinting company was saying, oh, these transactions look great. These are all located within your state. So they decided to do a proof of concept with DFP, Dynamics Fraud Protection, just to see what kind of results that they would get. So they liked it, they implemented it, and once it started working live, we found that those same entities that this other device fingerprinting company was telling them was located in their state was using street addresses in the state of Ohio to claim unemployment benefits in the state of Washington, and it was actually a fraud ring out of Sweden. And one of the reasons why we're able to hone in on that was one pixel was off on one of the fraudsters' computers. So with the adaptive AI and the machine learning, we were able to hone in on their location, alert the authorities, protect $2 million within 2 hours of activating the solution. So it's really important to look at the data, not just looking at what's going on with your state or with your agency, but we look at what's going on with like-minded agencies, and then we take it to a step further. What's going on in the retail world? And you may say, well, what does retail have to do with unemployment claims, unemployment benefits? It's because the entity, the computers that the fraudsters are using to claim unemployment benefits, for example, are the same computers they're using to hack and to buy things online illegally or fraudulently. So when you take that external data, think about all the Microsoft data, 23 trillion fraud and cybersecurity signals that are going through the network. Think about that. And when you combine those, you compress that into our consortium. So when you have access to that consortium, it's not just about your own individual department or state, but we can see across the norm. We can recognize 2/3 of this country's devices just because we're Microsoft. That is phenomenal. I come from the industry outside of Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft 3 years. And when I saw that technology, I said, oh my gosh, I need to be a part of it because it's not just retail focused. It's not just gaming focused. It's not just state and local government focused. I'll give you one more example before I turn it over to Ajith from Who I Am to give you the product demonstration. We have a international government utilizing this solution. The reason being is that they needed to know if the people applying for asylum were located within their country or they were applying for asylum outside of their country. And so the device fingerprinting information is helping them to weed through those applicants and make sure that they only grant asylum to those people who are following the rules and regulations and are located within country. So it's a quite diverse uh, type of solution, quite diverse of where we get those fraud signals from. And we invite you all to take a look at that and see how it could actually benefit your agency and your state. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, we wanted just to summarize the market vision that fraud can take many forms, but the most common is identity theft. We feel that states need to quickly detect high impact fraud that may indicate organized crime or identity theft rings. This means we're helping you be proactive, not reactive. Stop the fraud before it happens where you have to go chase the money. Programs, you need to provide timely access to benefits for legitimate claimants, and states need to restore confidence in their programs. The effective controls to mitigate fraud, it's so important in your stream of business. And the thing is that the government needs to work well when people need it the most. Trust Microsoft. That is one of our core components. One thing that we try to empower every person and every organization and the planet to achieve more. And we really do it through these types of technologies. So I appreciate your time for my section. Ajith, I shall turn it over to you and looking forward to seeing the demo.
Hey everybody, and thanks Sondra for setting all of this up. I get to do my favorite part of these webinars, which is doing the demos and things. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so thank you for taking the time to get on this call today and to work through all of it. So what we're going to do here is we will start with fairly high-level descriptions of how the core parts of DFP work, and then we'll get deeper and deeper and deeper until we get all the way through to the demo and the kinds of attributes and signal that DFP generates. So if you think about it just holistically, there are four core components that drive this DFP platform. So first up, you have adaptive AI technology, which in a sense, the simplest way to think about it is that it's machine learning algorithms that are very specifically trained for your types of fraud, for government related fraud, or whichever your industry is. Now, how do you break that down? If you think about a person coughing versus the sound of a dog barking, just instinctively you know, oh, right, this is a dog barking or that's a person coughing. Although, if you were to purely audio analyze it, they sound quite similar. Over time, you have picked up in your head enough data points where you're able to tell them apart. Machine learning, especially in this sort of scenario, works really quite the same. Once you've generated enough signal of what your typical authentication patterns look like, or what your typical purchase patterns look like, the algorithm in and of itself is gets really surprisingly good at being able to identify good traffic versus bad. So that's this adaptive AI. With DFP, the ML is tuned specifically for each client. So the kinds of fraud that a game fish and parks entity might see would be very different from child protective services, might be very different from an unemployment department in a state. So that's this ML piece. The fraud protection network is essentially all the signal that Microsoft gets to observe just because of their tremendous reach when it comes to think about Hotmail and Office 365 and their retail presence around the Xbox brand and Surface and all of those. So there's just this constant influx of data, transactional data across the world that then allows Microsoft to be able to spot fraud irrespective of what type of fraud it is. There's probably data backing it to where you have, in addition to the ML that's very specifically tuned to your org, there's more um, broad spectrum signal that they can add on to it. The next core piece to this is device fingerprinting, as you would expect. Any fraudster can trivially generate a ton of fake email addresses or perhaps phone numbers and things like that. And those are easy things to clone. But having a pretty robust fingerprinting algorithm makes it pretty much impossible or not worth anybody's time to be able to use a large number of machines to try to punch through a system. So fingerprinting is kind of a crucial piece. And then finally, with bot protection, this is again because of the amount of signal that Microsoft gets, you're able to spot things like, oh yeah, this set of IPs has been popping off in the last hour as generating a lot of bad traffic, or this set of devices we're seeing from several locations across the world as resulting in fraudulent actions. So these are the four core components that drive everything we're going to see. If you put all of this together into an end-to-end flow. So with WhoIAM as a firm, we focus quite heavily on the authentication and identity protection aspects of things. So the way we look at how DFP integrates into this whole end-to-end pipeline is the user's journey starts with them coming into your portal and they're trying to sign in. Your very first gatekeeper is some sort of web application firewall. In our case, we frequently roll out Azure Front Door, but you might have Cloudflare or Akamai or something there that does a network level protection against malicious traffic. Once you're past that WAF, you're now getting into your core identity system. So B2C, Azure AD B2C is what we use, but you might again have um, any other identity provider, and DFP does work with other identity providers. It's IDP agnostic. Once your user comes in and they're trying to create an account with B2C or they're trying to log in or some such, B2C's own identity protection capabilities, its conditional access, start kicking in. And that is where there's this really nice marriage between B2C and DFP, where DFP signals back to B2C with information on how risky this user is, or does this look a lot like bot generated traffic? And using those signals from DFP, B2C can decide to do all sorts of threat mitigations, and we'll get to that in a second. It also opens you up to be able to use a whole ecosystem of partners that provide all kinds of identity verification and identity proofing services. So in combination with these identity proofing capabilities, both internal to Microsoft as well as the external network, getting signals from DFP and letting a person securely log in. That's that authentication system. And uh, and finally, you also have this ability to log all of these transactions, including their fraud scores and such, into your SIEM solution. Again, we use Azure Monitor, but lots of our clients also use Splunk and several different SIEMs. And then finally, you're onto your application. So that's just this how DFP fits into an end-to-end authentication flow. To go a little bit deeper into the specifics of how that identity protection piece works, as we described earlier, yes, you have the Azure WAF, which is the first entry point for accounts that are trying to log in. Now, either you have fairly risky users or you have users who are somewhere in between in terms of their risk profile. Now, if you look at the far left and the far right of this diagram, the lowest risk users, you probably don't even need to bother them with an MFA mode because, hey, that's, yes, there is additional friction, but I know that this device belongs to Ajith and he's got and he's using his company email address and it's a clear low risk user. Great, you can let them through without burdening them with going through anything significant. On the other hand, if they're high risk, it's clearly malicious, and DFP is signaling back to you from the payload and the risk scores that it's sending back that this is bad. Great. You again don't need to go through the expense or the pain of MFA. You just summarily block the user from coming in. You might need to be careful about how you message it. You might say, we are unable to log you in at this time, or you might even want to provide a help desk link or something. But that's a straight block. Now, in the middle is where things are more entertaining because at medium risk, you might choose to say, look, we want you to do a one-time passcode redemption from an authenticator app or from SMS or some MFA mode. And this was where we were talking about there being several different providers in this space that you could use. Slightly more heavy-handed but robust is doing identity proofing. So if you're seeing them being in that mid to high risk area is where you might say, look, we, in addition to your having provided your credentials, we want you to do a liveness detection check. Or we might be partnering up with LexisNexis or Experian, and we want you to do verification of identity based on things about you that are known in the public domain. So those are things that you can do. So you, based on the kinds of responses you get from DFP, you can choose what your users' level of additional proofing needs to be before you let them go all the way through. As I'm going through this, feel free to pop questions into the chat windows. We have our team looking at those chats, so we can respond in real time as well. You don't have to save your questions for the end. With that, then let's go and look at a couple of really quick demos. So in this first demo that I'm going to show you, it's this is an example of Azure AD B2C integrating with Dynamics Fraud Protection. This is a standard page that shows an authentication screen within B2C. Let's try and do a user sign up. And you'll have to give me just a second here. I think I'm having trouble with my screen. Okay, so let's do I'm going to use a throwaway email address for this. I'm going to do a quick verification of that email address. Proving that I own the email. So this is a standard sign-up flow within B2C, and I'm going to agree to the terms of service, and I go ahead and create the account. Now, what happens here is during the authentication, during the sign-up process, B2C sends a request out to DFP. DFP to do a few different things. So first up, it's doing a device fingerprint, which now it has uniquely identified me with this device ID, which will stay constant given that my device attributes don't change. Um, Based on the way I have accessed the system, it's calling it out to be a fairly low risk score. I am using a Mailinator account, which is kind of a throwaway email address, which tends to be indicative of bot traffic. This is sort of a low mid bot score, but you can see that the spidey senses are tingling a little bit already. And so you're seeing a slightly elevated bot score. But overall, it hasn't triggered enough for DFP to say, yeah, there's anything wrong with this. So it approves you. You, as when you're configuring the system, you can set your thresholds for what results in your needing to do an MFA, what results in your needing to block. So in this case, this is just a straight up approved decision. I continue and I'm logged in. Now, this screen that you just saw was purely for a demo. So it's in reality, all of that transaction happens on the back channel. All right, so now let's look at another example. This time it's just an example of a shopping experience, for instance. So in this, let's go to, again, a quick registration. And I'm actually going to provide some information here that should look like good traffic. Okay, so I've entered all of this. I'm going to try and register my account. No, thank you, Edge. And that's it. I'm signed in, or I've signed up with this Ajith Alexander at gmail.com account. Now, again, demo site, so we get to show you some of the cool innards of it. If you look at the screen on the left, you're seeing the fraud protection request. What sorts of things did this site send over to DFP in order for DFP to return its analysis of this traffic? So as you can see, because we had entered all of this, it's sent in my username and my first name and my last name and the zip code. It has also sent in address information as well as yeah, I think that was pretty much all the information that we've sent over. You as the entity or the agency that is setting up DFP can choose what attributes to send over to DFP that will influence its fraud protection response. Now on the right, if you look at it, you'll see the decision was to approve the bot score again, like we were saying, because I've just come off of this machine with a Mailinator account. It's sort of mid-level, but the risk is fairly low, and overall, it's giving me an approved reaction. The other interesting thing about the fraud protection response is it's also giving you access to a ton of other device attributes and calculated features. So you can see where the user is coming from, is their device rooted, do they have a proxy IP that it's coming through, what browser agent do they have? So tons of great information here. Now, what's cool about all of this is you can also set up rules based on the response that the FP gives you or based on the input that you provide. So you might say something like, look, you know what? I don't want people logging in with Mailinator being able to come through. I might write a very specific rule for it. So let's take a look at that, right? If I log out, and this time I'm going to try to log in, and let's say I use a Mailinator account, and in this case, for this demo, I've set up a rule. And you'll see sign in was rejected by fraud protection. And of course, you might add a friendly message like you can try it again, as there's a random likelihood of this happening. But effectively, what has happened is we DFP triggered a rule that said, look, yes, we will make our assessment on bot and risk score, and you might choose to make to um, have thresholds where you block based on those risks, but we have a straight up very simple rule that just says, look, if the person's coming in with who at Mailinator. Of course, this is contrived, but it could be at Mailinator, or it could be throwaway email addresses. Or you might say, look, there is no way I should be getting traffic from these other countries. We are a small state agency. So you can set up all sorts of rules that catch and trigger based on that. So that's a demo of how the kinds of data that DFP generates, as well as how you can block or set up rules according to it. If you at the end of this call want more information on how you might be able to set all of this up for yourselves, what kinds of rules flexibilities you have, we can talk through that as well. And with that, John, can I ask you to share screen again, and we can get back to some slide where I'd like to walk through some of the reporting and observation capabilities that DFP has.
Ajith, yes. Let me share my screen again.
Thank you. Okay, so now that you've seen how DFP works and is able to provide risks and risk scores and bot scores and all sorts of data, let's look at how you might analyze all of this. With DFP, you also end up getting this dashboard that is fairly real time and brings back just this pretty incredible set of analytics that help you figure out whether your traffic patterns are trending differently from how they usually do. So this is an example of an all-up summary chart where you might say, look, in the I can see that majority of my traffic is all from the US. I can see a little bit in Hawaii, and there's some from Europe. Nothing particularly scary there. So okay, we're good to go. But if you look at the chart just to the right, which talks about session counts by average risk and bot score, you'll see that the orange squiggly line seems to be peaking at around the July 15 to 19 time frame, which is anomalous, and that might be something you want to dig a little bit more into. Let's go to the next slide, and that shows you. So the next 4 or 5 slides are showing you the different sorts of data visualization and how you might use it to identify that something's going on, or yep, that everything's fine and things are going the way you would expect them to. Take a look at the bottom of these 3 charts. Your average risk score, kind of corroborating what we saw in the previous slide, was that on from day 0 to day 15 of July, things seemed fairly okay, but you're starting to see a cluster of higher risk scores coming up between the 16th and the 23rd. So likely in that range, something has happened. Something's causing your risk scores to be elevated. So this is the kind of broad insight that you're quickly able to capture. John, can you move to the next slide, please? So again, this is a score distribution metric. So now we're getting deeper and deeper into trying to figure out, hey, what's going on here? You're able to drill this down to say, okay, look, prior to this 15th to the 20th of scores going high, when else did this happen? So July 5, 6, 7, again, we're seeing risk scores elevated, and you might want to be able to drill further into that and see what's going on. Great, yes, the risk scores are 600 and 700, but why? What triggered it, right? So John, if you can move to the next slide, let's take a look at reason codes. This kind of a visualization gives you very clear insight into what was triggering the machine models to give the kinds of scores that they are giving. And the neat thing about it is you can drill into any of these charts and get additional information. So again, moving to the next slide, if this shows you, look, in general, over a large period of time, my typical traffic tends to be mostly all Windows machines and a lot of iPhone. I don't usually see Android devices coming up as frequently. Again, example, But if you're seeing an anomalous pattern there, suddenly something is tipping upward, you might want to change. That might be cause for concern because you're saying, hey, all of a sudden we're seeing a new block of devices that are generating high scores. Are those devices coming from a certain area? Is there something specific about that model of device that's being used to launch these attacks? So then you might say, okay, great, let's drill in some more. Let's see where those devices are coming from. Which IPs are they? Are they geolocated in some area where we're being attacked from? That allows you to get into this next level. And then finally, John, if you move to the last slide on that for session details, this is where our engineering team actually finds a ton of value. Is you can pretty much go all the way down to specific transactions. So this user came in, they have a risk of 924 and a fairly high bot score as well. What happened? What was that transaction? What were the 3 or 4 reasons why DFP gave it the score it did? This can be good, and I mean it's always good, but the point of having this sort of drill down capability is occasionally you might need to field a call from your help desk that says, hey, I just got blocked out. What happened? But being able to go in here and say, oh, right, okay, it looks like you were coming in from a VPN and you were using a Tor browser, or you seemed to be doing something anomalous, or you always tend to be in these geographies and now you've gone somewhere else. That's why your risk scores were elevated. So being able to quickly go in and identify what the source of a high score is tremendously useful while you're setting up your DFP instance. Once you have it tuned just right, the whole idea is it it solves for the broad case. By and large, it just runs, and overall your need to worry about whether your users are able to get through, whether your fraud protection metrics are running as they should, and it makes that whole flow a heck of a lot easier. So now let's talk a little bit about our best practices and the lessons we have learned from doing these deployments across several different clients, especially in the government space. I like to think about this in sort of 3 phases. There's things you have to plan for in DFP while you're in that initial setup planning period. Then there are activities that you need to think through during launch, and then there's this ongoing, hey, what's my run state look like? So while planning, one of our observations is DFP works well after it's had a period of learning. So depending on we talked earlier about whether you're a child protective services agency or your unemployment or your game fish and parks, whichever agency you are, the types of data that your user base is generating are very specific to you. Giving DFP about 8 to 12 weeks of learning time, in our opinion, has been the sweet spot to where now that risk model is perfectly tuned. It was running in learning mode for a while, and and the scores that it gives and end up being extremely reliable. The next thing to think about is you have a big choice of MFA providers as well as email providers and all of those that you need to use. So when you think about DFP and the kinds of levers you have once DFP has given you a score, either you're accepting that the user is low risk and you're letting them through, or you're blocking them, or you're challenging them. So it's this challenge piece where you need to figure out how you want to challenge your user. And that's where the MFA concept comes in. In recent times, we're seeing SMS being less and less and less popular. A lot of our clients are going towards using other identity proofing capabilities or identity verifications. Authenticator apps are getting really popular, but that's specifically an area where you want to put in some time and think through it. Um, Special case traffic scenarios are kind of an interesting one. So quite recently, we had one of our government clients where I'll give you a scenario. Assume that your state sells camping permits, and in order to purchase a camping permit online, you have to go and register for an account. Now, if you're somewhere remote in right next to where you and plan on going camping, and you walked into a small grocery store where you're trying to go and quickly buy a camping permit so that you can go camp, you've just logged in on a device in a remote location. But unfortunately, aside from you, there are probably another 18 or 20 people who are also coming in trying to set up new accounts on that exact same machine in a fairly remote location. That would likely trigger, if without intervention, it would likely trigger as saying, hey, yeah, that's weird that this IP address in a remote location is suddenly generating 18 or 20 accounts all in a short burst of time. So that's an example of how you might have these anomalous scenarios that you know are specific to your agency, and you'll have to think about how you build rules and assessments that support your special cases. Exclusion lists are extremely powerful, kind of like how we just looked at blocking mailinator. You might have rules that say, okay, I don't want these bad or no, obviously poor passwords to ever be used, or I don't want people generating accounts with mailinator or with these throwaway email addresses. So any way in which you can think to add exclusion lists or inclusion lists, or you say, no, if they're coming in with myagency.gov email addresses, I always want them to get through, and I always want them to MFA. So you can do lists with DFP. Um, and the last part of that is you also need to figure out an end user support story. In the event that you are blocking a user, you might need to brace for getting angry calls. So, okay, how do you handle that? How do you instruct your help desk to unblock them? How do you tell them um, to go and try with a different set of capabilities? Sorry, I lost my train of thought because I saw a chat message coming through. But being able to tell your user who has called your help desk how to um, get over a block because of fraud is important. So figuring out that messaging is critical. At launch, like we said, the core idea is to launch DFP in shadow mode, get a lot of real production grade traffic, keep it running for several weeks, and then work closely with DFP with the DFP engineering team to set up your rules and your thresholds just perfectly so that now you have a system that runs reliably. On an ongoing basis, what we've learned is DFP has a set of APIs that they expose called the labeling APIs. And what that is after the fact, after your users have logged in and you've collected data, you will have information on how many of the DFP assessments were correct in that they legitimately blocked bad actors, or yeah, this was all good traffic and DFP led it through, and that's great. But it's the anomalies that you're interested in. Did I get help desk calls for people who were blocked when they shouldn't have been? Being able to send those labels back to DFP quickly makes the learning model so much more capable of identifying um, scenarios that are specific to your agency. So this labeling is a key crucial one. And then the other part to this is um, you can't fire and forget with a DFP deployment. You do need to have some sort of discipline around coming back to this at some regular cadence, looking at your charts and all of the visualizations that I just showed you, and seeing if you're seeing any new patterns creeping up. And this happens all the time. You might be running in steady state for several months, and then suddenly you're starting to see, oh yeah, we're getting weird access patterns from this IP at this strange hour of night. And then the next day it that pattern grows and it grows some more. So it's usually a good idea to have some sort of ongoing monitoring setup there. And the kind of the uh, um, one of the fantastic benefits that we've seen as partners to deploying DFP is that the data sciences engineering team with the fraud protection group are extremely hands-on. So being able to engage directly with Microsoft's data sciences engineering group allows us to be able to look at it both from um, the DFP internal data that they're collecting as well as yours, and come up with very specific rules and recommendations that the DFP DS team is able to recommend. So that's extremely powerful piece of collaboration that I'd strongly encourage that you do when you choose to go down the DFP path. So these are some quick best practices and things that we've observed. I think that just about wraps up everything that I had to talk through. We can open this up for questions.